Hello, friends. This is Dave Hurwitz, executive editor at ClassicsToday.com, and here is Finster, who's just hanging out while we do this, I guess. Maybe we can keep her in the frame because she's so much more interesting to look at than I am. There we go. She'll probably jump up and run away shortly. But in any case, here I am to talk about 12 essential operettas, zarzuelas, and musicals for beginners. We're talking about the more popular aspect of the lyric theater as opposed to grand opera. Now, as a principal matter, we have to figure out what are these things? What differentiates them from opera? Oh, there we go. I knew it. Okay, back to our normal position here. What differentiates these things from opera? And, you know, it's a very, very, well, it's hard to say. It's really hard to say. Some people say, well, operas are entirely sung and musical theater has dialogue. And that's true, usually true, but there are plenty of operas with dialogue. Fidelio has dialogue. Mozart's Magic Flute has dialogue. Carmen has dialogue. And those are all operas. So that definition doesn't hold water for too long. What it really boils down to, I think, simply is where they're performed. And that has to do with the kind of voices that the composers wrote for. Works written for operatic voices done in opera houses are either operettas or operas. And works written for popular voices, or normal voices, if you want to call them that, or employing popular musical forms, dances, ethno-nationalistic kinds of things. Those tend to be considered operettas also, zarzuelas and musicals. But it's a very fluid definition, and you don't have to worry about it. You know, you can if you listen to enough of these things, you'll come up with your own. And whatever works for you is fine. So I wouldn't worry about it in that sense. However, they are categorized differently for historical and whatever reasons. And so we're talking about it. Usually they're comedies, but not always. And at least they have comedic elements, irrespective of what the ultimate plot line dictates. And the comedy, the typical comedic plot line is always impediments to a marriage. That's the story. That's the comic story. It's true in comic opera. It's true in operetta. It's true in zarzuelas. It's true in musicals. It's true in all of these things. But one thing you may note, especially if you're from the English-speaking world, by my inclusion of zarzuela, is that every country has its own local traditions of musical theater. And the Spanish zarzuela tradition is deep and huge and goes back to the Baroque period. And most people in the English-speaking world really don't know much about it at all. I don't know as much as I'd like to. It's an incredible repertoire of stuff. But it is an operetta/musical thing in itself. And I felt it necessary because it's easily as important and musically rich as anything else in Western civilization. So you'll get to know some interesting things. If you are an operetta person, because they're, like I said, they tend to be local. But now we're going to fling open the doors to the international riches of these various local traditions. Let's start with the operettas. Well, we're not stopping with the operettas. We're starting with whatever order I wrote these things down in. Now, we're starting with 19th century operetta and moving our way into the 20th century. And ending with musicals, American music theater, which is its own genre. It is. We all have our things, which is kind of cool, but it has its roots in operetta and other stuff. So let's get going. Gilbert and Sullivan. Ah, yes, Gilbert and Sullivan. Well, we have two representative Gilbert and Sullivanian pieces. First, the HMS Pinafore. I am the captain of the Pinafore, and a right good captain too. We have to do Pinafore. These are wonderful pieces. I mean, Sullivan was a brilliant composer, with a real gift for orchestration. The tunes are fabulous. The stories are hilariously written by Gilbert, whose way with words was absolutely brilliant. It was one of the great partnerships in music theater. And there's a whole passel of things that they wrote, but I picked Pinafore to start with, and we're going to continue with the Mikado. I mean, it's the Orientalist masterpiece of the English 19th century theater. And of course, the Japanese society depicted in the Mikado is suspiciously similar to English society. Of course it is, because they may be Japanese and they may have little Japanese tunes running around, but they're all English, incredibly English. And that's, of course, part of the joke. But there's an important point here, because one of the things that Gilbert and Sullivan did was parody English society, English culture, English literary and other trends in their operettas. And that brings up an issue which runs through these pieces like a little thread. And that's the element of social criticism. The fact is that these pieces were written for a bourgeois or popular audience, not for an aristocracy that had a vested interest in maintaining the status quo and which supported the arts on condition, unspoken sometimes quite spoken, that the status quo would be exalted and supported and affirmed. And that's one of the big differences between these lighter genres, more popular genres, and grand opera. That aspect of social criticism, even sometimes revolutionary sentiments. And it's particularly true as we get to the American musical theater, where social issues are paramount in some of these pieces. So it's very, very interesting to note that particular aspect, how the popular appeal influenced the selection of plot lines and the way the characters interact, even though the overall plots, that is, people trying to get married and getting confused and all of the comical situations, I mean, are similar as well. But the setting and the context are often very, very different from what you find in grand opera of the day. You don't find a lot of mythological characters unless they're parodies, as, for example, they are in Offenbach's Orpheus in the Underworld. So if Gilbert and Sullivan were the operetta people in the UK, and of course there were other composers writing these things. Remember, Offenbach was the guy in France, and there were other composers. Lecoq was incredibly popular, for example, even though nobody's heard of any of his stuff now. Messager, people like that, they wrote operettas too. There's a whole zillion bunches of people doing these things. But Offenbach is your guy, especially if you're a beginner and you want the essential stuff. And by the way, as with all these essential lists, I might add, we are only dealing with the list. Do not suggest any additions or deletions in your comments, please. The whole point is that to provide a repertoire for people getting started, and for people who may be in the middle of it but who don't know all this stuff. So anyway, Orpheus in the Underworld. Of course, it's a myth. It's a parody of the Orpheus myth. I mean, the famous can-can, which is the chorus and dance of the demons in hell. Actually, they all do the can-can. And so, we have to keep in mind that when these things happen, they usually happen with a even stronger vein of sarcasm and social criticism, as is the case here. It's a little bit more obvious in our next Offenbach operetta, and there's like a bazillion of them, and so you really need to get into them when you can. La Grande-Duchesse du Gérolstein, the Grand Duchess of Gérolstein, which is it's an anti-militarist tract, actually, about a Grande-Duchesse and her amours and her attempt at finding amours, and various generals running around and starting a war, and all kinds of stuff happens. But the militaristic element is is extremely strong, the anti-militaristic element. I mean, Offenbach makes fools of all of these military figures. And the piece was written in 1870s, 1860s and 70s. We're talking about, Franco-Prussian War, things like that were happening around then. All kinds of stuff with armies running around and making fools of themselves. And that you can find graphically portrayed in this delicious little piece by Offenbach, which has like a bazillion great tunes in it too. I mean, it's just gorgeous. So after Offenbach, we have Gilbert and Sullivan and Offenbach. That gives us 4 already, right there. And you've got a core of, operetta English style and operetta French style. Then we've got German or Austrian operetta. I mean, German, there is German operetta, sort of, kind of. It's really Austrian. It's Viennese, which is where operetta really took off in Germany. And it took off most significantly with Die Fledermaus by Johann Strauss Johann Strauss Jr., or the second. It means the bat. And it's a delicious story of, disguise and masquerading and all that stuff, and people running around and doing sexually salacious things. I mean, that's the idea. And after Die Fledermaus, with tunes of which you probably know, the overture is incredibly famous, and the plot really kind of irrelevant, but it's wonderful. No, it's not irrelevant. It's wonderful music, and it's fun to listen to, and it has that fabulous gala. The fabulous sort of party scene where people go up and sing songs and they can insert things and have guest singers do famous arias, and it can go on for weeks. It's an absolutely delightful work. After Die Fledermaus, we have Lehár, Die lustige Witwe, the Merry Widow. And the Merry Widow is just that. She's a widow. Everyone's after her. She's after them. There's a battle of the sexes going on between the Merry Widow and one of her suitors, which goes out through the whole thing. And then they finally get together in the end, of course. Franz Lehár lived quite long, lived till I believe it was the 1940s, I think. There a lot of these things we consider them to be very old, but they're not. They're really not. They all date from the post 1850s into the first decades of the 20th century. That's the big period of operetta. And the origins of the later, musical theater that we all enjoy today, because it was, as I pointed out before, an art form of the emergent middle classes, the bourgeoisie, the people who had some money to spend and wanted to see a good show. And so before that, there were also operettas. There were versions of them. For example, if we're talking about Zarzuela originated in the Baroque period, actually in the 1600s. And there are 2 big periods of Zarzuela. There's around 1650 to 1750, the Baroque version. Excuse me, got an itch there. Wait. The Baroque version. And then there's this sort of middle foggy period. I mean, Boccherini, for example, it was about, 1760s, I think. His one sort of operatic thing is actually a Zarzuela. And the stories are consistent with what we know of musical theater. They're all comedies with, marriage and things, or mostly, for the most part. Some of the Baroque ones have some of those Greek characters flying around, some mythological things, but they're all done usually in a comedic vein. But after about 100 years of other things taking over Spanish theater, like intermedios and stuff like that, intermezzos and little one-act thingies, Zarzuela made a comeback in the latter half of the 19th century as part of Spanish nationalist thought and nationalist culture. And for that reason, because it was a popular expression of nationalist sentiment, the plots are often dealing with the social situation in Spain, which was a nice jumble in the 19th and early 20th century. As you know, when things are in turmoil, you usually get really good art, and Zarzuela is no exception. First, these are both 20th century Zarzuelas from the 1920s, I believe, and 30s. Federico Moreno Torroba, Luisa Fernanda. Moreno Torroba was a wonderful composer. I mean, he wrote Spanish nationalist music. There are 2 discs of his guitar concertos on Naxos that if you don't get them, have them, get them. I mean, it's absolutely wonderful stuff. And Luisa Fernanda is a delicious story about what was going on in the 1860s, during the revolutionary period in Madrid. The revolution against Isabella II and democracy and aristocrats and monarchists, and they're all going at it. And against that background, you've got, the usual love interest, mistaken identity, well, not mistaken identity, but, comedy of manners or of errors and things going on. And yes, it all ends up happily. Doña Francisquita by Amadeo Vives. He's famous because he wrote a La Boheme called Bohemios. But Doña Francisquita is another one of those wonderful stories of confusing things running around with everybody, in love with everybody, and it all gets sorted out in the end. But the music is so full of color and Spanish flavor and juicy wonderfulness. It's absolutely phenomenally fantastic, and it's very, very popular. It's been recorded many times. Vives was another fine composer, and these are all. There's so many more of them. I can't even begin to make a list. La Verbena de la Paloma, that's another big one. And it's just zillions of them. If you get into Zarzuela, it's a little bit difficult. There are a lot of recordings of Zarzuela arias and excerpts and things like that, but the actual discography of Zarzuela is enormous. It's enormous in Spain, but recorded usually in like the 50s and 60s, somewhat dimly, and they could be hard to find in other parts of the universe. But wow, what a legacy. And they fit perfectly within our overall concept of musical theater and operetta and that kind of stuff. So yeah, you got to have a couple Zarzuelas, or you just haven't lived. And if you like Spanish music, and who doesn't like Spanish music, you find some of the best Spanish, colorful, nationalist, melodic richness in this repertoire. That's absolutely fabulous. Just wonderful. So there are those 2 suckers. And let's see, then we've got, now we go to America for our last 4, actually, because here we find a wonderful melting pot, right? It's America, so it has to be a melting pot of musical styles. There was an American style of operetta, best represented possibly by Sigmund Romberg's The Student Prince. Remember that? The big American operetta guys were Romberg and Victor Herbert. Victor Herbert did, Babes in Toyland and, things like that. So there were American operettas, and they were written for operatic voices, and they were derived audibly from the Viennese tradition for the most part, but also, a soupçon of French stuff and maybe a little Gilbert and Sullivan too, because all that stuff was enormously popular in the United States. Either from touring troupes or, troupes of actors and musicians or native ensembles. Gilbert and Sullivan. We did a Gilbert and Sullivan every single year that I was in prep school. That's 6 of them. And I was in them all. I had parts in most of them. We did Pinafore. We did Pirates of Penzance. We didn't do the Mikado. We did Iolanthe. We did Patience. They were just wonderful. So, these things were ongoing. It's a tradition out of which arose American musical theater. And you can look at works like The Student Prince by Romberg as quasi-traditional, transitional, somewhat transitional, as part of that emerging tradition of American musical theater, which really, by general consensus, burst into full flower when Jerome Kern and Oscar Hammerstein, the 2, did Showboat, an extraordinary, big, long, fat musical that nobody knew just how big and long and fabulous it was until John McGlynn made a recording of the complete thing, which took like 3 discs, goes on for hours and hours. It's a really, really major, serious work, and it has all of the themes that we've been mentioning, that we're lurking about, the idea of social commentary, ordinary people with ordinary lives having extraordinary problems, and crazy situations. In America, of course, there's the issue of race, and there's domestic violence, and there's all of these clinical and psychological elements that you would never find in a grand opera. Now, of course, the reverse has happened, because contemporary opera often features these things. And I think one of the problems of contemporary opera is that it becomes too close to operetta and musical in its choice of subject matter. It's trying to be socially relevant, which I think is a terrible mistake. I think opera should be as irrelevant as you can make it. But that's me. Anyway, Showboat, which is absolutely glorious, has tons of famous tunes. It's amazing. Then we've got Rodgers and Hammerstein. Of course, you have to do a Rodgers and Hammerstein. Carousel. Now, Carousel is really interesting because it's a tragic story. I mean, it ends happily, sort of, kind of. But it's a tragic story. It's about a carnival barker who marries a guy. He's a domestic abuser. She gets pregnant. They lose their jobs. He tries to stage a robbery to get money to support his wife. He winds up committing suicide. And then there's the whole second act where he commits suicide in the second act, but he's up in heaven, and he gets to go down and has one day to make amends for all of the wrongs he's committed and to tell his common law wife, or whatever she is, that he really loved her, and his daughter, who's bitter and miserable and going to her high school graduation as a loner, and he's trying to make amends, and he sort of does in the end, but it's a very, very serious story, and it's treated seriously. It really is, and it's got You'll Never Walk Alone, one of the most guaranteed songs to have you in tears at the end. Really, really an amazing work, and quite revolutionary in the history of music theater. It was the attempt of people to, the composers to broaden and deepen the range of expression, and they did it very successfully. The other thing that music theater has, by the way, along with operetta and all these Zarzuelas and all these things, of course, usually is dance numbers, popular song forms, strophic songs, things like that, more of them anyway than opera usually does. I mean, opera often has a ballet stuffed in the middle of it, so you can't say that this is unique to the lighter genres, but the way that the dance element and some of these other popular musical types is incorporated into the ongoing plot line is somewhat special. It's very special in Bernstein, West Side Story. Our last, and certainly not least, sort of the apotheosis of the sophisticated American musical. It's another tragedy, definitely a tragedy. The story is Romeo and Juliet. I mean, it's based on Shakespeare's Romeo and Juliet, transported to Hell's Kitchen, which is the section of Manhattan's West Side between around like 34th Street and 42nd Street, in that area on the West Side, and 9th and 10th Avenues. Now, of course, it's high rises and luxury condominiums. But back then, and even when I was younger in the 60s and 70s, it was a very, very tough neighborhood. And you've got two rival gangs. Well, you know the story. Tony and Maria are, related in ways to each of these two groups, and they're in love with each other, but it doesn't work out too well. Tony gets killed, and that's in the end is solemn and sad, and also very beautiful. But the music is extremely sophisticated. The ballet element is fully integrated into the ongoing plot. Actually, I don't know if any of you ever saw this, but there was a sketch comedy show called House of Buggin', which was the brainchild of, I believe, John Leguizamo and people like that, and the Latino comic crowd, and it was very funny. And they did a sketch that was absolutely hilarious that involved the dance West Side Story dance gang running into an actual gang on Manhattan's West Side. It was very, very, very amusing to see the dancers doing all their stylized pirouettes and things while these other guys are sitting there with like knives or switchblades or whatever. Anyway, that's neither here nor there. The West Side Story is I think, sort of, well, it's an iconic work, of course. I mean, some people consider it to be Bernstein's masterpiece musically, but it shows you that musical theater, American musical theater, could be absolutely as sophisticated as opera or anything else out there. I mean, it's a much better work than Bernstein's actual opera, A Quiet Place, which is just horrible. So there you have it. If you are a beginner interested in the lighter genres of musical theater, then these 12 works will get you started. You'll have a lovely collection of things to savor and enjoy. Do pay attention to the words. Get the words somehow if you can find them. All of these pieces are very popular. So, librettos or books with the songs and the words are not hard to come by. And listen for the commonalities in these traditions, which are wonderful and colorful because they're local, but which also deal with universal themes of love and social justice and all kinds of other good things like that. So thank you for joining me, friends. I hope this little list has been helpful or will be helpful in getting you started. Keep on listening. Take care.